I want you to move from overwhelmed by information to confident in what really matters. I want to help you move from being unsure towards direction and purpose in your healthcare. I want to introduce you to health experts. I want to let you in on tough conversations on women's health. I want to give you a place where you can lean in and learn how to take care of yourself. Let's transform your health. Let's get clear on your goals. This is Women's Health Unplugged. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Robertson, naturopathic doctor. This is our 50th episode, and I can't believe that. When I started this project of the podcast, really had a very different feel to it. I actually didn't really even understand who my audience was. I knew that my background in research and in what we call critical appraisal, which is reading research and then deciding whether it is accurate or not, or where it fits in our sort of current knowledge construct about medicine, was my background. So I knew that the podcast was going to have this sort of flair of research-based discussions. And initially, we really set out to try and conquer some really specific medical discussions around particular health issues. And I did it from this like super hardcore research-backed presentation of it. And really what ended up happening is I was drawing an audience of mostly practitioners at that time and not really serving the wider population of women with that information. And over the last couple of years, so that first year, I really didn't publish very often because it took a lot for me to be courageous enough to try and take on the topic. I wasn't as comfortable being vulnerable and talking about just personal experience, right? Because my background with being so heavily based in research, it felt like me talking about my experience or my clinical practice was not appropriate. I think I've kind of come around this concept that storytelling and using research to emphasize why stories are happening and, what the greater big picture in medicine actually is actually a much more powerful way of connecting the bridge between what we know about medical literature and what women get exposed to as far as the amount of, or the kind of health information that they get access to, that me not showing up more vulnerably, me not showing up and using story as a way to connect women with information was actually not really serving women. It wasn't serving women, period. I was letting there be, influence from less evidence-based information. I was letting women be exposed to, aspects of health online, which are not evidence-based, but also kind of prey on women in their vulnerabilities. And I wanted the podcast to actually give women this opportunity to connect with legitimate scientific information and literature about their health, but done in a way that actually just empowers them to take better control, that gives them some language, for how they can interact with their healthcare experience in a different way. So what I wanted to share in this 50th episode was basically to give you some insight around optimizing and using your hormones to your advantage. I think that's, one of the things that I want to educate women about is that hormonal health is not something to be upset about. It's not something for us to shy away from. It actually is something that we should be leveraging as women. When I think about what my deeper why is for why I do what I do, and truthfully, like if you haven't done this exercise around your deeper why for your health goals, I would highly recommend that you do that. I have patients do that often. Nobody's real deep why is to lose 5 pounds. You need to think much beyond that to figure out why, right? Like the deep why, like why do we want to achieve that goal? So when I think about my deep why, like for work or for what I do, yes, I want you to have less acne. Yes, I want you to sleep through the night. Yes, I want you to understand your nutrition and know how to make good choices in that regard. But the reason, right, like the reason that I want that for you is so that you can show up in your life as the best version of yourself that you are. So when I think about what my big hurts are, when I think about the world, when I think about the environment, when I think about my children, we need a different landscape of leadership in all avenues, right? Whether we're talking about finance, whether we're talking about education, whether we're talking about healthcare, we need women to be leading these revolutions and be able to show up fully and healthily to tackle some of the major issues that we have in the world right now. And whether that's, a fifth grade teacher showing up as her best self, right? To be there for the younger generation that's growing up, whether that's a woman being able to, assertively and confidently ask for, the management of a project that's going to change the way a company utilizes green energy, like whatever it is, women are, in a powerful position to actually have a real impact on the things that I cannot personally impact on my own, right? I have these dreams and these desires for the world to be a better place. I have these dreams and desires of healthcare and policy and, all of these things to rise to this higher level, which I deeply believe requires feminine leadership. So maybe not just females doing that leadership. I think it requires feminine leadership. And we can't have our female leaders or our feminine leaders feeling unwell 50% of the time because of their hormones, right? We will never get to where we want to go as a species, as a gender, as like we will not get to where we want to go if we don't feel well a lot of the time, or if we don't know how to leverage our hormones naturally in a way that allows us to show up as our, best self in those circumstances. And when I work with women or sit down with them one-on-one, these are often the things that are coming up for them, right? It's women will put up with a ton until it starts to influence her function, right? Until she starts to see it showing up with the way she interacts with her family or her ability to feel confident and execute in the workplace. So women will put up with pain and fatigue and quite a bit of suffering. But when it starts to show up in her ability to do her work and to lead a purposeful life, that's when she lands across the desk from me. And she thinks we're talking about energy, right? But really what I'm talking about is how do I create a more powerful woman and female leader that then goes back into the world and does all the things that she is capable of to better our world. So that's my deep why. So when I'm thinking about sort of this 50th episode and what to share, and I wanted to give some insight around, using or understanding your hormones in a way that lets you show up better. And I don't mean that in a judgy way. I mean that like I want you to feel better so that you can be better in your life, and use and understand your hormones in a way that actually helps you leverage that. Because I think one of the challenges we have, and there's been lots of cool books written about this, now this is as a discussion topic in science and even in sort of cultural studies around women, is that women don't feel the same every day. Right? Our state is not the same every day. Whereas a more male or masculine state is to, men are on a 24-hour clock, right? Their circadian rhythm, their day-to-day experience. Yes, they're on an aging sort of clock, which will change their hormones, right? As they age, they do have changes in things like testosterone. But they are, for the most part, like let's say if we looked at a year as a defining amount of time, men are on a 24-hour clock, so they have these like 365 very similar days hormonally. Whereas women do not have the same state in a 24-hour period. And women actually can have a dramatic change in her state over a 24, 48-hour, 72-hour window as she fluctuates from one part of her menstrual cycle to the next. So women theoretically are on a 4-week cycle or on a 28-day cycle, plus or minus, right? Your cycle might not be perfectly 28 days. But women do not feel the same way every day. But yet, when we kind of show up in a more sort of masculine workplace, we absolutely have this expectation that we feel the same, do the same, perform the same every single day, when like biologically that is not what is happening for us. And so I watch women feel a lot of shame for having that experience, but also to work like uphill against their natural tendencies and these natural fluctuations, because they're trying to show up as what they remember to be the best version of themselves to be, even in weeks where that might not be completely possible. But also, like, often we're working at a pace that is at the expense of our health, which makes those hormone symptoms show up more dramatically, which, like, the irony, right? Like, women are pushing themselves to work very hard to fit into this sort of more masculine version of the workplace. And the harder they push, the more hormonal they feel, right? So I'm going to coin that term that I say your urban woman bad behavior is actually worsening your PMS. And that's what I mean by that. It's the late nights, the tons of caffeine, the lack of nervous system rest and reset. These are things that actually worsen PMS. And so the more that women try and fit into these are the very masculine, patriarchal, corporate model of the workplace, the greater their hormonal symptoms are going to be amplified, which is, it's just ironic. The harder they try, the worse we feel. So when we start explaining this concept to women, there's kind of two sides of it, right? Like, there is the one side where I just want women to understand what's happening. And I think that can sometimes be interpreted as we are a slave to our hormones, right? And when I start to explain this to women that they have different states, I can feel them feeling uncomfortable that I'm implying that there's a couple of weeks of the month where we are not going to, and I'm saying in air quotes, perform at our optimal capabilities. And that's not what I'm saying at all, right? What I'm saying is that women need to be mindful of their different states that they're in order to leverage those opportunities in order to feel their best on average, like over an entire month. Rather than, like I mentioned, pushing sort of uphill against those natural states and tendencies. So what happens through the menstrual cycle is a profound fluctuation of estrogen and progesterone. And really, those are the hormones that have the biggest impact on how we feel. Certainly, testosterone levels also do fluctuate through the cycle. And sometimes women will have pockets of time where their testosterone sort of shows through and gives them sort of like a higher opportunity to leverage that particular hormone. You'll often see in some of the literature on sport that women who are naturally cycling, meaning that they're not on an oral contraceptive or not on any kind of medication that suppresses or changes their cycle, that their strength and performance may peak at various times in their cycle. And we think that that's correlated with generally low levels of estrogen and progesterone and maybe high levels of testosterone as it starts to, like, as a relative number, show through at various parts of the cycle. And there's been lots of cool discussion around that, specifically for things like weight training and strength-based sports. But the primary hormones that impact how women feel through the cycle, and the ones that really do quite a roller coaster of change through the month, is estrogen and progesterone. And they're the ones that seem to have the biggest impact on our cognitive function. And that's kind of when I think about or talk about performance for women, I'm thinking about cognitive function, and I'm feeling about physically how well do we feel at various times in the month. Because those are the things that really are kind of getting in the way of women's optimal performance. So when I'm speaking about these hormones, I'm talking about women who are actually having a regular menstrual cycle without medication being involved. And I can sort of mention a little bit what happens when we have anovulatory cycles. So anovulatory means there's no ovulation and we don't make all of the hormones that we're supposed to. I'll talk a little bit about what happens there. But in a regular menstrual cycle that is not being medicated, there are sort of 4 states to sort of think about, or 4 weeks of the month that sort of impact the way that women feel. So day 1 is that first day of your menstrual cycle. I can't tell you the number of times that I smile when I ask women how long their menstrual cycle is. They'll say 3 days, right? Because they're talking about the number of days of bleeding that they have. But your menstrual cycle is actually the entirety of the month, sort of from day 1, which is that first day of bleeding, until you come back around to the next cycle, which would be the next day 1. But during your actual menstrual cycle, your hormone levels are relatively low. And for some women, this is an absolute relief. So women who struggle with PMDD, women who struggle more with PMS, as they shift into that next cycle and their hormone levels are low, they lose body water that maybe they would have been hoarding as bloating or breast tenderness, and they get a relief of the mood-based symptoms that they may have experienced in the back half of their previous cycle. So during that time, estrogen and progesterone are both low, and they're really supposed to be low. What happens in perimenopause is that those hormones may, or estrogen specifically, may dip below low. So there's low, and then there's like menopause low. So in perimenopause, sometimes women will have a dipping of their estrogen during their menstrual cycle, and that might show up for women as really low mood. So I'll get women who say, I have reverse PMS, like I feel fine, and then when my period starts, I feel terrible. Or it may start to have some breakthrough menopausal symptoms like insomnia or hot flashes or night sweats during your period. So if you've noticed that and you're, say, over the age of 40, we may be looking at some low estrogen, but like low. But during that first week and a half, women generally feel pretty good. Estrogen starts to be produced into that, second half, like around day 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Estrogen is the dominant hormone during that time. And really, this is where women feel their best. So cognitively, we're sharper, we're more confident, we can thrive on less fuel and less sleep. So we have less cravings and less appetite, and we don't need to sleep as much, and we have more energy. And this typically is that frame of time that women excel at whatever their passions are. So whether it's work, whether it's play, whether it's hobbies, whether it's reading, focus, attention, conversation, leading, managing, those are the days where women feel their best. And they're often the days that when women say, I wish I felt like this every day, that's the pocket of time that they are striving for, or that they wish they felt like. Estrogen does help support our ability to, it helps us lead conversations. It helps us with focus and concentration. It helps our short-term memory. Our sleep is deeper, so we may not need quite as much of it. We don't have lethargy or fatigue, and we generally carry the least amount of body water or extra body water during that time. So women feel lighter, they feel leaner, they maybe don't have joint pain because they don't have this like extra fluid retention. They generally feel their best. And this is the time that they wish they felt like for the entire month. Now, some women, as we head into ovulation, this is like their peak, connection, conversation. They're more chatty because estrogen levels really do rise with ovulation. A small caveat, and this doesn't affect all women, but right before ovulation, estrogen levels really dip. So some women who are really sensitive to the mood changes that they experience through their cycle may actually notice that estrogen levels dip right before ovulation, because it might actually trigger either a migraine or a more depressed day than they experience other times in the month. I personally am actually quite affected by those low estrogen dips. So both at the beginning of my cycle, but also right before ovulation. And probably this is because I'm like highly attuned to what's going on and I've tracked it for a long time. But that day 12, 13, right before ovulation, when estrogen levels decline, there's a significant worsening of my mood. I'm a little bit more likely to have a migraine on that day. So lots of women don't notice that. And if they don't, right, or if their estrogen levels are high enough, they may sort of soar into ovulation, having these peak estrogen levels and feeling quite well. That's where women crave connection. Our communication skills generally are quite good. We're more resilient, right? Like this is kind of the way to put it, that you can put up with more nonsense. It's not like the straw that breaks the camel's back, right? You're able to take on more during that time. And again, I caution women not to fall into the trap of believing that this is how we should be all the time, right? Because like I said, we can go on less food, less sleep. We're more resilient, right? We can get all sorts of stuff done during that time, highly productive, highly confident. But when we work at 150% during that time, we're actually creating some, I'm going to call it like a deficit, right? Like we're drawing from the bank that then later in the month, we're probably going to make up for. So just keeping that in mind. But those are the good times of the month. So, there's been some cool books written about this, but essentially during that time, we are very capable of like big picture, 5-year plan, creativity. You can be way less task oriented, although if you have lots of tasks, you'll probably get them all done. But we are capable of those bigger picture conversations, those bigger picture thoughts about our lives, our passions, and our purpose. As we transition into that PMS window or premenstrual time in the month, right, which is really the whole 50% of the second half of the cycle, progesterone rises with ovulation. Now, for some women, progesterone is a very positive experience, right? The hormone itself does have a bit of an anti-anxiety impact on many women's brains. It is that sort of softer, quieter, more restful side of ourselves, which is kind of the opposite of the way women feel during the first half of their cycle. So women may be more introspective, they may be more quiet by nature, they're more sensitive. We're definitely more sensitive to the people around us. We're more sensitive to facial expressions, to tone in conversation. This is the time, and sometimes this does us a disservice, right? If we think about PMS, women often can't tell the facial expressions of the people around them. So sometimes it actually works to our discredit. But this is the much softer, version of ourselves in this second half of the month. For other women, that rise in progesterone has a really negative impact on their body and on their mood. Specifically, women who suffer with PMS or PMDD, the effect that progesterone has in the brain is more of a negative one. There's actually less resiliency at this time, more significant depression, less ability to stimulate joy and happiness during that time. We also physically shift during that time as well. And so we generally carry more water retention, more bloating, more breast tenderness, more physical symptoms. Women may have more fatigue. They may have more joint pain and just be more achy overall. And generally, our inflammation levels also go up. So it's a very layman way of describing it, but I will say to patients, like wherever your inflammation is, PMS will put pressure on it, right? So let's say you have a nagging knee injury. your PMS experience will raise inflammation there as well, and it may creep in more significantly during that window of the month, which we've talked about on the podcast before. It makes it really hard for us to diagnose what's going on hormonally with women, because sometimes they have underlying joint pain that's worsened by PMS. Sometimes they have underlying depression that's worsened by PMS. So is it a hormonal issue, or are we talking about the underlying issue? Right? It's hard to tease those two things out. But during that phase of the cycle, we are a little bit less capable of the conversation, confidence, big picture, 5-year planning type style of work. We generally need a little bit more time to complete tasks. We're a little bit less creative, even though we're more introspective. We're less likely to be the more extroverted side of ourselves. Even if you identify as an introvert, there are times where you may feel more confident sharing and being extroverted, and that PMS window is really not one of them. So during that time, women will look at their, capacity and capability and really judge where they're sitting, right? They can see that they're not showing up as that energetic, creative, verbose person that they had been 10 days earlier. But really, because the way we've set ourselves up, that we kind of have that expectation we're going to be her all the time. When we enter into this second phase, we generally are, we have shame about that, right? Or when this is where women will notice that they're not quite as productive as they would like to be. And I want to sort of challenge that concept or idea around productivity, because I think it's our definition of that makes it more challenging for us to embrace or accept this second half of the month. So during this time, women probably need to go to bed a little earlier. They probably need to diet less, eat a little bit more carbohydrate, have less alcohol. These are things that are basically gasoline on the experience of PMS, or that calmer, softer side of ourselves, right? If we stay up late, have alcohol, drink lots of caffeine to get through, and then demand that we show up in the same way that we felt 10 days earlier, we're really not honoring sort of this more quieter, natural, softer side of our cycle. During this time, I generally will suggest that women do focus more on task-based work, because they're short. We generally have all of the resources within us to complete those types of, I'm not going to call them menial tasks, but I think we all know what those tasks are, right? Like where we have to sit down and do a little bit of bookkeeping, or we need to fill out some paperwork, or we need to read through something quietly. These are things that we are highly capable of doing during this time that doesn't require us to, have millions of neurons firing and multitasking and then share with our colleagues what we're learning. These are things that we are inherently not quite as adept to at that time, and we certainly would gravitate away from them if we were given the choice. And so I think we can do ourselves a favor by recognizing that and not setting ourselves up with tasks on our list that we know are not well suited for that time. So if I even think about, and I'll use myself as an example, people will say, oh, you post a ton on social media. And I'm like, well, not in my luteal phase, right? Or the content that I use in my luteal phase is often something I've posted about similarly before. Or I share something that I've noticed that someone else has posted that I really enjoy. There's less creativity, there's less originality, there's a little less humor coming from me specifically, because that's me pushing the boulder uphill at that time. And I could easily sit down in front of my phone and try for 40 minutes to think about a post I wanted to put up. And then in the end, decide that nobody cares what I have to say, and I'm not that smart anyways, and I'm probably going to make a spelling mistake. Like it's not a productive use of that time. And it's really pushing against what is natural at that state, which it's way more effective for me to curl up with PubMed at that time and bank concepts and ideas and things for later when I do feel like sharing, when I do feel creative. And so I think if women can examine their month and the types of tasks and things that they have to do at work, and certainly we all have these time sensitive things that show up right in the middle of our PMS week. However, the way we prep for those things, or the way that we set ourselves up to be successful at that those things, I think can leverage those different states that we have in a way that just honors what our natural working state is a little bit better. So I don't want women to feel like they are a slave to their hormones, but I also want women to not be pushing the boulder uphill against their hormones, and also realize that our definition of productivity shouldn't just be about continuously producing, right? Because that's not, I think you can think about your work and your life, and there are times when the goal is not continuous production of stuff, right? Or continuous production of thought, or continuous production. There has to be the other side. There must be other moments where you are required to quietly information gather, or you are required to be a listener instead of a speaker, or it's highly productive for you to go to bed a little earlier, or to quietly spend time with your children rather than on your phone. So I think we can probably just think about what that definition of productivity means over a month and shift when we put those things so that we are not pushing upstream. And I am like the world's worst procrastinator. I joke that it is an absolute miracle that I've only run out of gas once in my life. But when I can see a presentation that's coming 2 months away, I know intuitively, and also because I've spent a lot of time on this, that I've got 2 cycles to think about this presentation and block the time that I need to be creative and put pen to paper, versus the time that I'm going to information gather and will adjust it against the days where I know I'm going to be successful at those tasks. Because to me, the worst time management we can do is when we ask something of ourselves that we know in that moment that we won't be able to accomplish. Whether that's us not giving ourselves enough time, whether it's not honoring how we feel, whether that's, being unrealistic about our expectations. And sometimes for women, we can have unrealistic expectations about what we're going to get done because we're setting ourselves up. We're putting a task in our most fatigued, most sensitive, I would never pitch an idea to a friend that I wanted feedback from in the middle of my PMS week. Right? Because what am I asking for? I know I'm extra sensitive. I know I'm extra tired. I know I'm not particularly receptive to feedback. Whereas if I schedule that same conversation, 13 days from then, I'm highly resilient, right? Much less high maintenance emotionally, and can tolerate the kind of feedback that I actually would like to receive, right? So I think we have some opportunities there if we just start to think about those natural states. And again, renegotiate our definition of productivity in those times, because it can be highly productive for you to go to bed. Which leans into that second part of the conversation. So the first is I just want women to understand, right, that you don't feel the same every day, and we need to drop that expectation of ourselves. The second half of it is recognizing that that boulder that we're pushing uphill is actually making our PMS worse. So every single urban woman bad behavior that we do actually is a risk factor for worse mental health during our cycle. And it actually makes the stress of ovulation less tolerable. So in theory, and I use this example when I'm working with women, I'll say, when you were in your 20s and you ovulated, did you even know? Right? And it's pretty rare that women even knew, right? They may not have identified, lots of young women have menstrual cramps, but a woman's experience of her PMS often starts to be amplified in her 30s, or even having post kids. And part of the reason for that is that when we're in our 20s and we're young and we're resilient, and I know that this is not always the case, but this is often the case, that subtle shift in hormones is not a catastrophe, right? It is not consequential, and we probably don't even know that it's happening. But when we layer on years of stress and poor sleep, poor nutrition, sedentary lifestyle, high demand lifestyle, like I keep coming back to my coined term, that urban woman, now she's stressed to the max, right? Like in all aspects, physically, emotionally, the woman is stressed. The shift in her hormones is now a catastrophe. So what she normally had experienced as being not that big of a deal now is a very big deal to her brain, right? Her brain is not resilient to the shift in hormones. And this is called the differential sensitivity theory. So when we're looking at it scientifically, we know that for some women, ovulation is a monumental stress. For some women, ovulation causes a significant shift in her brain chemistry that lowers her resiliency and changes the way that her brain functions during those 2 weeks. And this is part of the reason why she does not feel well. But all of those things that she's doing to push that boulder up the hill during that time are actually worsening the cycle, meaning like the vicious cycle that she's in, so that the following month is just as difficult or even more difficult than the month prior had been. And so part of this understanding piece comes, how do we unravel this, right? Like, how do we help women feel more consistent? And part of it is we need to understand that we don't feel the same way every day. And part of it is that we need to lean into taking care of ourselves so that ovulation is no longer a catastrophe. And that's really when we start to think about how we're supporting women, that becomes one of our treatment goals, is how do we help you be resilient enough that your estrogen changing from 300 nanomoles per liter or picomoles per liter up to 600, or your progesterone going from 2 to 30, right? Like these are small shifts in these hormones that are happening. But to a woman who is not resilient, to a woman who is depleted or depressed or has trauma or has other stressors or is sleep deprived or who is dieting or all of these things that are putting pressure on her system, that shift in those hormones is a monumental experience. And so when we look at starting to unravel some of that, part of it is having women lean into those different states, but also for them not to overdo it during the times that they feel well. And I get it. Pacing is a really hard thing to teach patients, because when women get this glimmer of feeling good, right? When they get that early follicular phase, estrogen in the brain feels great phase, women go, well, thank God, because I have a lot to do. So you can see how this translates into this vicious cycle where women are overdoing it during their follicular phase. They don't feel well in their luteal phase or their PMS phase. They suffer with shame and guilt and push that boulder up the hill and try and force themselves to do all of these things anyways. And then they finally come back into that next follicular phase and they're like, well, thank God, because I have a lot to do. Right? So this vicious cycle of progress and, perpetual achievement for women is actually setting us up for more PMS and more discomfort in our hormones, which then is making the subsequent month also more difficult. The reason I wanted to share this as part of my 50th episode is because this is something I've had to hack myself personally in order to show up as a female leader in healthcare, as a woman who, surface level can look highly productive, right? We put out a podcast every week. There's blog episodes every week. I run a clinical team with a thriving, very busy practice where we see thousands of patients per year. The speaking gigs, all of those things. So surface level, that all looks really great, right? And I often will get asked by my colleagues, how do you do it all, right? And the key or the ticket is that I don't, or that I'm really specific about when I'm going to leverage my time. So in my early follicular phase, I will record 3 podcasts in a week, right? When I'm feeling great. I will write a ton of content for things, right? Whether that's Instagram or blog posts. I will think big picture and strategize with my team and get ready to delegate tasks that can then be completed while I'm in my luteal phase and I'm quiet and at home and having a cup of tea by myself, just reading, right? So I've set up these systems so that during those times where I don't feel quite as well, that the ship is still moving forward, right? Or I've created enough things during my creative and generally feeling well phase that it trickles into this other phase. But also I will clear the deck as far as clearing my plate, meaning that I have way more rest and recovery time during that phase. I exercise a little bit less. I go to bed a little bit early. I nap more. I read more, right? There's much less of this trying to pull difficult concepts together because I'm just not as capable of it during that time. And I really do personally struggle with my mood during PMS. It does not interfere with my work, but it definitely interferes with my creativity and ability to drive forward my projects other than clinical practice. And so it's important for me to leverage those pieces of my health so that I can show up consistently and well. And my deep why, right? My bigger purpose is to help you be able to do that. And so I need to take care of myself so that can actually happen. But also, I want to share that it's a normal experience, or I should say it's a common experience. We're working towards it not being normalized, but it is a common experience for young professional women to struggle with their mood during their 50% of their cycle. And part of that is built from our high expectations of ourselves and lack of ability to pace ourselves and nourish and take care of our nervous system. Again, so that ovulation feels like this big catastrophe. So what I would suggest sort of going forward for you as a listener is to just track what you're noticing about those states, right? And maybe it's not tracking it like in a period tracker app, but maybe it's noticing like, hey, like I was super on fire today, right? Today was the day where I wanted to run for president of my company. Or today was the day where I really hit it out of the park when it came to that presentation. I was super creative. I can see the big picture today. And just note where you are in your cycle when that happens, because probably you're in that early to late follicular phase, meaning that you're somewhere between like day 3 and day 12 of your menstrual cycle before you ovulate. And then if you're noticing that there's times where you're more fatigued, where you're more tired, where you feel like I keep using this boulder up the hill analogy, but really like jobs that you're normally very competent in, that you feel like you're not able to do, right? Like that there's something wrong, that the normal, expectations that you have of yourself, you're not capable of doing. And then just write down when that's happening, because my guess is that's happening somewhere between like day 14 and 28 if you have a regular cycle. Those are going to be the days where you're absolutely like boulder up a hill, not capable of having those same like professional expectations of yourself that you would earlier in the cycle, and just tracking them and start to sort of pay attention to, how can you forecast the following month so that you can set yourself up for better success, but also what are those like urban bad behaviors that are maybe getting in the way, right? Are you lighting the candle at all ends and in the middle? Are you on a complete hamster wheel from month to month? Those are the kinds of things that you need to pay attention to get out of that cycle and to not feel like you have to, rearrange your whole cycle or rearrange your whole schedule so that it coincides with your cycle. So I want to thank you one more time. This is such a cool it's so cool that we've made it to 50 episodes. I've really enjoyed sharing, especially over the last 6 months where we've really changed the way that we're sharing information on the podcast. I love the guests. And I would totally suggest that you reach out if you have a guest or if you are a guest that would like to make an appearance on the show. I can be reached at jordan@drjordannd.com. I also would suggest that you join our private Facebook group, Women's Health Unplugged. So it's by the same name as the podcast. And there we do Q&A style videos. I usually do Facebook Live once to twice a week, dissecting down some of the concepts that we're talking about in the podcast every week. So I would suggest that you meet us over there where I can connect with listeners a little bit more closely. But thank you for being a dedicated listener. I'm so excited for our next 50 episodes. This has been an amazing experience, so thanks for following along. I hope you enjoyed that episode of Women's Health Unplugged. It's my absolute passion to bring women quality and science-informed information about their health so that they can make empowered, good decisions about their health care. I'd like to invite you to join me in my Facebook community, Women's Health Unplugged. There we share live videos, blog posts and behind the scenes information about the podcast, where you can connect with me and other women who are interested in their healthcare. You can find us at facebook.com/groups/WH Unplugged. We'll see you there.